Hello, everyone, and welcome back. So we're looking at polynomial operations, and in this unit, we're going to be talking about polynomials. So let's understand a few things that we need to know before we look at what a polynomial is. So remember in algebra, when we're saying, we have a letter, so let's say, let's say we have X or A or Y. So we have letters that represent an unknown, okay? Now, what are these called? These are called variables, okay? So it's really important that you recognize these terminologies before we move forward. So letters that represent unknowns are called variables. And when we're talking about something like this, so if I now use some letters with numbers, so here's a coefficient of 2x plus 1, or even 3x or 5 over x minus 2. These are all called algebraic expressions. Okay, so you're expressing something using algebra. So 2x plus 1, it uses algebra, uses x and variables and so on to express something. So over here, this is called an algebraic expression. Now, moving on to polynomials, we want to start with first, what is a monomial? Okay, monomial. Now, a monomial actually refers to a number or variable or the product of numbers or variables. So if I look at something like this, for instance, if I say but it's one term, okay? So this over here is one term, and this refers to number or variable or the product of both. Okay, so what would this look like? Well, a monomial could look like this. A monomial could include things like 3 or 2x, right? So 3 is just a number. 2x is a number multiplied by a variable, so the product of a number and a variable. I could have something like negative 1 over 4xa, for instance, okay? I could have a multiplied by b multiplied by d, or I could have 2x squared y cubed, for instance, right? So these are all, what do we call them? We call them monomials, okay? Now, why do we call them monomials? It's because it is one term. It comes from the Latin word mono, which means one, okay? So that's how you can remember it. Now, why is this one term, even though there's all this stuff going on? Well, have a look at this. This is a product of a number and a few variables, right? But here's the thing, it's not 2x plus 1, for instance. Now I'm looking at a product of a number and variable plus another term. So this is where I'm looking at more than one term, right? This is more than one term, so it's not a monomial. Then what is it called when I have more than one term? Or a sum or a subtraction, right? So a sum or a difference of more than one term, we call this, yep, you guessed it, a polynomial. Okay, so what is a polynomial? It is the sum or difference of monomials, right? Monomials. So if I take something like this, if I take this example that we wrote over here, right, then what we see is I have a monomial, which is the product over here, right? A product of numbers and variables. And then over here, plus 1, well, 1 is also a monomial because we said they could be either a number. This is without the S. So it could either be a number or a variable, or the product of numbers and variables. So there you go, a number, a variable, and, with the product of a number. So we're looking at a polynomial, right? So as long as you have the addition or subtraction of monomials. So if I have something like this, let's say I go -1/2 plus 5x minus 2. This over here is again a polynomial. Why is that? Is because it is the sum as well as difference of monomials. Okay? All right. So now that we understand what a polynomial is, what do we need to know about polynomials moving forward in this unit? Well, in order to classify a polynomial, so to say, okay, what kind of polynomial we're working with, well, we need to be able to say, you know, is it, right, we can classify it in two ways. We can say, oh, based on its degree, so is it, does it have a degree of 2, a degree of 3, a degree of 4, and so on. So over here, classifying polynomials. How do we do it? We do it in two ways. Okay. The first way we can do this is by the number of terms. So this is one form of classification, right? Number of terms in the polynomial. And the second classification is the degree of the polynomial. Okay, what degree of polynomial? Okay, so let's talk about what that means. So when I'm talking about the number of terms in a polynomial, we're talking about, is it with one term? And we said that when a polynomial has one term, that is called a monomial. When it has two terms, let's see what that would be called. So over here, if it's one term, and remember, a term is basically a one piece, the numbers that are in between those addition and subtraction signs, this is a term. This is a term, and this is a term. A term is basically the number or variable or the product of a number of variables where it's only one item on its own, like this. Okay, so if I have one term, we call this a monomial. We already talked about that. If I have two terms, if you know the Latin word for this is called bi. Bi stands for two, so binomial. Okay, and then three terms, this is called a trinomial. And honestly, they kind of gave up after that. They're like, okay, we don't want to keep going further. So they said four or more, okay? So four or more terms. That is what we're going to just call an open polynomial. All right, so just a polynomial. Okay, so let's look at examples of these. So if I'm looking at an example of a monomial, we've seen stuff like this. So 2x or 5x over 2, for instance, or 3, -3 over 1, x squared, y squared, for instance. This is what a monomial is. It is one term, okay? So let's have a look at binomials. Binomials would be two terms. So I'd have, for instance, 2x plus 1, or 3, -3. That was useless. Let's go. -3 over 2, x squared, y squared plus y squared, for instance. Okay. And then an example of a trinomial would just be three terms. So we can go 2x plus x squared minus 3, for instance. That's an example. Another example could be 5x plus 2 plus y. Okay. All right. A monomial, a polynomial is just going to be four or more. And we kind of classify just a polynomial. So when we're talking about polynomials, if we're classifying them first by the number of terms in the polynomial, I go 1, 2, 3, and then 4 or more. We just call them polynomials at that point. You don't classify them. You just go like it's a polynomial of 4 terms, or simply just call it a polynomial. Okay. All right. So let's talk about classifying a polynomial using the degree of the polynomial. So when I'm classifying, let me just erase this. So when I'm classifying a polynomial using its degree, then I consider something like this, right? What is the degree of a polynomial, right? We need to understand first what the definition of saying, oh, the degree of the polynomial. Well, when we talk about degree of a polynomial, we're really talking about the highest power in this polynomial, right? So if I have something like this, let's say, let's just write that down first. Degree of polynomial is the highest power of the I'm sorry, is the highest power in the polynomial. Okay, so it's the highest degree basically, but so you could either call it power or degree. Okay, so let's talk about an example of this. So if I had something like this, right? So if I had, let's look at an example. So an example, let's say go 3x squared y squared minus 2x4 plus xy4 minus 2. Okay, so I'm looking at this polynomial over here, and I'm asking, okay, what is the degree of this polynomial? Now, what you do is, in order to understand what the degree is, you need to add, okay? So you need to add the degrees of each one in each term. So, for instance, if I'm looking at, if I'm looking at this first term, then I'm saying, okay, well, what is the degree of this first term? Then I go, well, what is the sum of, so term 1, okay? I go, how many do I have? So I have a 2 plus a 2. So degree of this first term would be 2 plus 2, which is equal to 4. And then the degree of the second term, so term 2, would be just this 4, so just 4. And then the degree of this term would be, so term 3 degree would be, look at this imaginary 1 over here. So I go 1 plus 4, and my degree is going to be 5, okay? And then the degree of the last one, if there is no variable, so you get the degree value from the variable. So if there is no variable, then you basically say, oh, okay, then my degree is just 0. Okay, so then you say, okay, well, what is the highest degree that I counted here, right? So in order to get the degree of each term, we said we add the exponents over here, we add the powers, and then I said, okay, so once we've added them, then in order to get the degree of the entire polynomial, so degree of poly is just the largest degree we found. Okay, so which one is the largest? Well, it's 5. So when I say the degree of this polynomial of 3x squared y squared minus 2x4 plus xy4 minus 2 is basically 5. Okay, so that's all you do. You go through term by term, and then you say, okay, what is the degree of each term? And then now that I know the degree of each term, I say, okay, what is the degree of the entire polynomial? I just choose the largest degree I found. Okay, now when we're talking about polynomials, it's important to understand that sometimes when we're writing it, we need to write it using using largest degree to smallest degree. So typically when you're writing polynomials, this would have been the first one over here. So you start with the largest degree and then you descend on your way, okay? So polynomials in single variable are usually arranged in ascending or descending order. So if I'm talking about polynomials of single, let's write it over here. One last topic over here. So polynomials of single, of single variables. So things that don't include like X and Y, just X, for instance, single variables. Okay, so we typically write them from, we write it in ascending or descending. Okay, so write polynomial in ascending or descending, but you can't just write it all jumbled. We'll talk about what that means right now, descending degree. So if I have something like this, right, I have x squared plus 2x plus 1, for instance. This is a polynomial of a single variable, right? Now what's happening here is that my single variable is x, and I'm writing it in descending order. I chose to write it in descending order, descending degree. So over here, this is 2, 1, 0, okay? I could also write this. This is a correct way. Another correct way would be 1 plus 2x plus x squared, okay? So I started, so this is in ascending order. I started, ascending means going up. So I started at 0, and then I went to 1, and then I went to 2, okay? So as long as I'm writing in ascending or descending order, then that's what I'm talking about, okay? All right, so there is one last piece of terminology I want to highlight here, which is the leading let's give ourselves some space here, leading coefficient. If you're ever asked for a question where it talks about the leading coefficient is the coefficient in front, or the leading term is basically the highest degree, okay? So highest of, in front of the highest degree term, okay? So if we're talking about this one, for instance, that's the highest degree. Its leading coefficient is this imaginary one, okay? All right, so that's really it for this chapter, everyone. I hope that helped, and I'll see you in the next, not chapter, that's it for this section. I'll see you in the next section. Bye, everyone.